Welcome back, AP. Welcome back to it. Welcome back to a flip after just an absolutely fantastic day of class. I just want to go ahead and throw this out there. The vibe that y'all brought yesterday in class, right at the very end of the day, y'all were killing it. Everybody was answering questions. Y'all were getting excited about answering questions. Y'all were flying me down like a plane and stuff like that. I got Mackenzie Clark dropping quipus in the middle of class. We're talking about llamas. We're talking about like Incan sacrifice of children and the differences between the Aztec sacrifice systems, Machu Picchu, and then like I think it was Tuttle over the back even knew that like Cusco is the capital city of the Incas, and y'all even knew that they had like 10,000 miles of trade routes. Gotta give mad respect to my guy, Mr. Waterson, right? Now, the big thing about it, though, is y'all also were super engaged. You were very energetic. You were getting after it. Just keep that vibe. Keep that vibe going. Roll it into the next day, and let's keep crushing this thing, right? But let's go ahead and jump back into right where we left off when we're talking about in class, right? We last left off talking about this guy, right? King Atahualpa, who is going to have a major confrontation with this guy, Hernan Cortez's cousin, Francisco Pizarro, right? Which I agree, Tuttle, looks a lot like pizza roll, right? Like, so now the big thing about it, though, in general, is we're going to see the Spanish conquest of the Inca in several different, like, main factors and similarities and differences between the Spanish conquest of the Aztec, right? Now, the thing that we always like to focus on before we go anywhere further is that these Incan people were a highly sophisticated society, right? Extremely sophisticated society that may have lacked a written language, but did have a numbering system in their quipus and had terraced farming and had like a sophisticated religious structure. Also, they had like domesticated llamas and they were moving forward. It's just important to remember that these are not these heathens that the Spanish had actually written about for a very long time, right? Now, the thing going forward, though, as well, is you have to understand that Pizarro is going to roll up on the Inca, and the Inca were massive just like the Aztecs, right? We're an empire home to more than 1 million plus people, but the Inca were really weak at this point, right? Very, very weak, and they were going to be very easily susceptible to attack, right? Mainly for two reasons. One, because there was a massive civil war between the Incas, right? The Incans had a civil war within their society because King Atahualpa and his brother went to war with each other trying to see who could claim the throne of the Incan people, right? Their father had died. They both claimed the throne. Atahualpa is going to end up being the winner, but as we know, civil wars cause a lot of death and destruction, right? So the thing about it is, though, is also, you need to understand, like, we're talking about a very large war, a violent interaction. So some of you are like, well, wait a minute, Mr. Terry, if they're having, like, a civil war and, like, a really intense military interaction with one another, does that mean that they have, like, a very sophisticated military, right? Do they have, like, weaponry like the Aztec did with obsidian blades? And do they have, like, armor or anything like that? Not really, right? So the Incan military was a little bit different from the Aztec military, and they actually only used wooden and stone weapons, right? For example, this right here was one of the main weapons of the Incan, right? Inca bolas, yeah. An Incan bolas was a very, very prominent weapon of the Incan societies, right? The rope tied to several stones and stuff like that. And you can see actually as well in some of these pictures, Incan warrior. You can actually see as well that Incans actually carried around very simple cloth armor and used very simple, actually, like wooden and stone implements, right? Now, the thing about it, though, is so they're not going to be as strong militarily speaking as the Aztecs, but it's still important to understand that Pizarro is bringing even less people than Hernan Cortez did to actually take over the Inca. He's only bringing about 200 people. Now, King Atahualpa is also not stupid. He knows the Spanish are coming. He can see his people dying from smallpox and disease and things like that, and then also measles and influenza that is being spread to them by some of these like colonials and by some of these like Spanish like conquistadors, right? So the thing about it is King Atahualpa came up with a plan. He knew and heard what happened to the Aztecs, and he was very, very well aware that more than likely this could result in violence and the destruction of his people if he didn't try to get out in front of it, right? So what King Atahualpa did is he tried to plant a trap, right? He tried to plant a massive trap to try and trap Francisco Pizarro and all of his warriors in a square in this city called Cajamarca, right? So really, really quick, I'm going to jump over to my whiteboard and I'm going to draw it up for you. And I'm also going to flash some pictures up and stuff like that here in about 2 seconds, okay? Okay, guys, so the thing that we're talking about right now is this thing called the Battle of Cajamarca, right? And I'll go ahead and write it up here really, really quick so you can actually write that down and everything. But it's a very, very key point in European history that demonstrates just the outright differences, technologically speaking, between the Spanish and the natives that they were coming into contact with, right? Now, we talked about it with the Aztec, right, with their swords and blades and things like that, but this is a really, really key moment because it's even after the natives tried to set a trap and tried to destroy the Spanish conquistadors that they're still going to fail, and it's going to demonstrate heavily the just dramatic differences, technologically speaking, between the two of them, right? This is actually outlined in a very, very famous book by this guy named Jared Diamond, who's an evolutionary biologist who wrote this book called Guns, Germs, and Steel that I really like a lot if you ever get bored and want to read some really, really dry history, right? Now, the thing about it, though, is Cajamarca is an Incan city, right? And the plan was that Atahualpa was going to lure the Spanish into the city of Cajamarca, which is going to be small and it's going to be tight, and they thought they were going to be able to kind of rush them or jump them and actually be able to take over, right? The thing about it, though, is I'm going to flash up a picture of the city of Cajamarca real quick. And as you can see, the big thing about it is it has a very central square area, right? It's got a very large square that the Incans had built and stuff like that. And there were houses and different things along the sides. And there were like shrubs and buildings and whatever that went around the edge of the square, right? Now, Pizarro knew for a fact that this was going to be happening here. And he had an inkling that there may be a trap set afoot for him, right? So Pizarro decided to actually try and set a trap for Atahualpa, right? Tried to basically double cross him, right? So the big thing that he does is Pizarro takes all of his men, his cannons, his guns, his horses, and everything, and he hides them in these different areas all around the exterior of the square, right? He hides them in the buildings. He hides them behind trees. He hides them behind walls. He hides them behind shrubs. He hides all of his men in the area around the square. And here comes Atahualpa and his men, right? Atahualpa is entering in not with a handful of people, there's a couple hundred Spanish here, but Atahualpa is actually entering in with 1,000 people, right? He's entering in with over 1,000 different individuals. They are all possessing in, they're coming in, and they're filing around the square, and here comes Atahualpa into the center of the square himself, right? Atahualpa is also not walking into the square. He is being processed into the square on what is known as a litter, right? A litter is basically like a stretcher that the men would carry on their shoulders, and Atahualpa was sitting on top of it on this big throne that was just bringing him inside and everything. And so when Atahualpa actually comes in and his litter is parked right there, all of a sudden, Pizarro springs his trap into action. Now some of you are like, what, did they jump him? They just rush him all of a sudden? No. There was a signal that actually would send to them the word to actually jump out of their hiding spots, get after it, and actually try to take over the Incan people, right? Now remember, we've got thousands versus hundreds, right? You should be seeing a dramatic Incan victory by the numbers, right? But what ends up happening is, from the edge of the square, here comes a priest, right? A priest walks out carrying with him a Bible and a cross, right? He walks up to Atahualpa and he is saying, you must submit to Christ, become a Christian, renounce your polytheistic ways and your heathenistic ways, right? And he's shouting all of these things. And he's holding this Bible and he hands the Bible to Atahualpa. But the thing about it is, you got to remember, is that Incans don't have a written language. So what is a book to Atahualpa? It's nothing, right? It is absolutely nothing to him. So he looks at this book and he flicks through the pages and he's like, what am I supposed to do with this? And he just throws it down onto the ground. And then at that moment, the priest starts going, oh, you have violated the sacred Christendom. And he literally throws his hand down and then bang, that's the signal for the trap to get set. Pizarro starts ringing bells and firing guns and shouting and throwing different things and then rushes all of his men in from the outside, causing massive chaos of the thousands plus Incan people that are in this square. The Incans end up trampling over one another. Several hundred of them end up dying this day and being killed by these Spanish conquistadors. And the only injury that one of the 200 Spanish conquistadors incurred was a twisted ankle. One of them fell off their horse, right? This is an image, right, that just shows that even though the Incans had over 1,000 people and went up just a couple of hundred Spanish, the Spanish were still able to dramatically win due to their sophisticated technology and due to the fact that the Incans lacked forgeable metal, lacked resistance to disease, and also lacked other technological things that the Europeans had, right? And it's just a big demonstration to us that the Spanish could have came in peacefully, but they knew that they had the advantage, and they used their weaponry in a terrible, violent way, and they were able to dramatically just take over all these people, regardless of how sophisticated they were. Yeah, so thank y'all for riding along with me with that big story and stuff like that. I love throwing those pictures up, and I love telling that story, right? But the big thing about it in general is that you also need to understand We're talking about this event, the Battle of Cajamarca, which occurred in 1532, right? We're discussing it so we can just demonstrate the different factors that no matter what the Incans did, regardless of their attempts, they were not going to be able to beat the Spanish due to these different technological differences, right? Now, that's not to say that, like, the Aztecs pushing out Cortez the first time wasn't a monumental victory for them, but then curry that with the spread of disease, and it was just going to be borderline impossible to stop the Spanish force that was coming in to set up these different new colonial holdings, right? So what's going to happen after the Battle of Cajamarca is actually Atahualpa doesn't die, right? He doesn't die. Like, Pizarro actually takes Atahualpa hostage and holds him for ransom, right? They walk back to Cusco, and literally, like Pizarro says, we demand a huge amount of gold, right? We demand all this stuff. And literally, Atahualpa walked them in to this massive, immense fortune of gold and silver, because they actually walked them inside of this place known as the Temple of the Sun God, right? They walked them inside, and the walls were lined with gold. And like, Atahualpa was like, obviously you can tell we have plenty, so I'm more than welcome to, like, pay you to keep me alive, right? So Pizarro actually says, we want rooms like this filled with gold and silver. Atahualpa says, okay, and pays the Spanish, but then what they end up doing is they execute Atahualpa anyway. And it's in one of the most screwed up ways I've ever heard. They actually force Atahualpa to convert to Christianity. They give him a new name. They call him Anthony instead. And then they strangle him to death, right? Like, so, like, this is absolutely ridiculous, and it is a horrifying, like, consequence of these, like, of European exploration during this time period, right? So we'll talk more about that also in class, but now what you're seeing through the Battle of Cajamarca, through the conquest of the Aztecs, these different individuals just don't really stand, like, any kind of realistic chance, militarily speaking, of stopping the Spanish, right? But once the Spanish show up in the Caribbean and South America, Peru, northern South America, Central America, and all these different areas, what are they going to do? Well, now they've taken over all this stuff. They've decimated, like, sophisticated indigenous populations. They've done all this terrible, horrific stuff. Now what? Now what do you want to do? What do you want to do with all this land, y'all? Like, so, well, the thing about it in general is they're going to start setting up colonies, right? So the Spanish are going to begin to create a colonial administration in both the Caribbean and, like what is now modern-day Mexico, going all the way up into Texas, going into Central America, and then going into South America, which is why these different areas to this day speak Spanish. All right, so, like, that's a very important thing to understand, the connection between the modern era and the history that we're talking about, right? Well, the colonial administration is going to work like this. They're going to begin to break up the large sections of these different colonies, the areas of Mexico, Cuba, all the islands and things like that, and they would turn them into what's known as viceroyalties, right? Kind of like a province in an essence. And each of those places would be ruled over by a viceroy, right? And the viceroys would report back to the rulers of Spain. Ferdinand and Isabella are still ruling by this point, because the Battle of Cajamarca actually happened in 1532. Hey, Siri. When did Ferdinand of Spain die? Oh, no, actually, they're super dead by this point. Ferdinand and Isabel actually died in, like, 1504 and 1516. Wow, that's actually pretty bad. So by this point, though, their descendants have begun to take over, right? And they're actually being ruled, like, the descendants of their descendants. There we go. Their descendants is actually Charles V, right? Charles V is going to become a very major player as we get further into this. It's their grandson, right? Like, so now, the big thing about it in general, though, is silver and gold, obviously due to the Inca, were discovered by the Spanish, right? And so that is going to be their main thing that they want to get out of these different, like, areas, right? In northern South America, Central America, they're going to set up massive amounts of gold and silver mines as fast as possible, right? They're also going to decide to start using the temperate climate of the Caribbean and also of South America, and they're going to start planting sugarcane, right? I love teaching about sugarcane to kids from Louisiana. It's ridiculous, right? Like, so sugarcane is going to be planted throughout all these different areas, and it's going to become a booming industry, right? Also, livestock is going to be ranched, and another big thing is like several other different types of plantation economies are going to pop up. But here's the question. Who is to work all of this different area? Because as we talked about with the Battle of Cajamarca, with the Aztecs, the Spanish aren't bringing that many people, right? They're not bringing thousands of people that's going to be necessary to mine gold and silver, to plant and harvest sugar, to actually ranch livestock, right? So who's working? Well, that's the first phase of the screwed up part of this story. that enters into what's now known as the encomienda, right? The encomienda is a very, very screwed up system that was enacted by the Spanish, right? To force the remaining natives to work for their lives, right? It actually set up a system where they did not have to pay these people whatsoever. It was supposed to be this really screwed up exchange. But what the encomienda is literally a system of forced labor put onto the natives, the remaining natives of the Aztecs, the Inca, and the other local indigenous populations of South and Central America, right? Now, the way this is supposed to work, though, is this Spain granted colonies and colonists the right to force the natives to work in a form of free slavery, right? Now, looking at the entire setup, right, there was the plan and then there was the reality of the encomienda, right? The Spanish tried to make themselves feel better about this whole thing by being like, oh, we will care for the natives, we will help Christianize them, we will build them churches and infrastructure and give them better things to survive. You freaking liar. So now, the Indians were then only supposed to work, the natives were then only supposed to work a portion of their day for the Spanish settlers. But what the reality actually turned into was that the Spanish settlers forced long labor, did not pay them, failed to protect them, and seized their lands as they died off due to disease. Also, the natives are going to die from disease, harsh living conditions, and extremely terrible working conditions where they were forced to work all day constantly. Because you have to understand, sugarcane farming takes a lot of labor. You have to grow it. You have to harvest it. You have to literally pull all the water out of it like in a press. You then have to boil it, which is very dangerous, right? The gold and silver mines were the worst places to work. Literally small, narrow holes that literally only children could fit inside of, carrying 500 plus pound carts of raw actual substrate to try and get gold and silver out of it. They could easily die or fall down a ventilation shaft or fall into a fire that was used to vent the mines out. The encomienda is going to end after clergy protests. This is how bad it got. That Spanish priests finally were like, this is so screwed up, it must stop, right? But they are going to continue under the replacement known as the Repartimento, right? So, the big thing about it in general is that this entire system is going to set up a terrible, awful situation, which is going to kill off a large amount of the remaining natives, right? So, these are natives working on a sugarcane plantation. This right here literally demonstrates a Spanish, conquistador actually, literally abusing and beating a native, an Aztec or Incan native. And then this right here, you can actually see the massive amount of gold and silver coming out of the mines. But who is bringing it out of the mines? Not them. The natives are, right? So the thing about it, though, also in general that you need to understand is that as this continues to progress forward, okay, listen to me carefully, jot this down. As the encomienda begins to kill off the remaining native population, and the remaining native populations begin to assimilate with the Spanish, this is going to create a smaller workforce. This is then going to push the Spanish, this is going to then the Spanish are going to start doing the most screwed up thing in all of history, and they're going to start stealing Africans from Africa, and they're going to start literally founding the colonial administration on the use of African-based slavery, right? So keep that in mind as the encomienda literally push the native population further down. African slavery would be used to replace them, right? So you could have just paid people to work. I'm just throwing it out there. Now, so the big thing about it in general is that also as you see this thing progressing as well, we're now into the 1530s, the 1550s. The Reformation is raging throughout all of Europe. All these different things are going down and happening. But here come the English and French trying to set up colonies of their own as well. So when the English and French try to set up colonies, they're mainly setting them up in North America, okay? So they're going to start setting up their colonial administration and having some of their earliest attempts to set up colonies in areas like modern-day Canada and along the east coast of what is now the modern-day United States, right? The French are going to be the ones that strike first, and they're going to be the ones that I know y'all were probably thinking about yourself, Addie Stein might be rolling around my mind. I thought you just said they were mostly journeymen and their colonies didn't really work out. Well, that was in the earlier part of the 1500s. Getting into the later part of the 1500s, you're going to see the French set up colonies in Canada using the Mississippi River to go all the way down also into what is now modern-day Louisiana, right? So, and of course, the crescent moon right here for the Crescent City. Some of the earliest settlements, though, have to do with Montreal, Quebec, Louisiana, and the islands in the West Indies. Particularly one when we're talking about is called Saint-Domingue, or was now modern-day Haiti, right? So the French are going to set these things up, and as you can tell, agriculture was not their main thing, right? They were setting up a lot of these colonies in areas where those journeymen are still coming over, hunting furs, trapping furs, and looking for different items to then bring back to France, right? So something very important that you need to understand is that French colonies grow incredibly slowly, right? Because it's literally just single men coming over and like trying to find stuff and then go back to France. Another big thing is Spanish colonies grow in a different way, but mostly single men were being sent to Spanish colonies as well. This is in dramatic juxtaposition to English colonies, which hug the Atlantic coast, and the early settlements, including places like Roanoke, Jamestown, Plymouth, Massachusetts, right? Y'all have talked all about that stuff before, I'm sure, when you were in like some different areas, and you will talk, or like in some different parts of your schooling, and you'll talk about it a lot whenever you have Mr. Watterson, right? You'll talk about the early colonies. The thing about it is Roanoke was the earliest English colony, and then they lost it. Like, I don't know if y'all know about that whole thing, but in the late 1500s, they tried to settle the Roanoke colony with Sir Walter Raleigh outside of the, like in the Outer Banks area of North Carolina, and like after he left and came back, there was no one there. Roanoke is the lost colony, and all they found written into a tree was the word Croatan, so we believe that actually the natives might have actually killed all of them off. Now, the first permanent settlement that the English set up is in Jamestown, right? Jamestown, Virginia. Now, the thing about Jamestown, Virginia, though, is that they're going to find a massive amount of money in one key product after they survive those really harsh winters, right? Well, really quick, before we get to the product, you have to understand that literally the Jamestown colony is also a really emblematic colony as well, because they almost died as well, because literally there was this thing called the Starving Times, and I love talking about this person, Jamestown Jane. From 1609 to 1610, in the winter of that year, literally almost so many of the colonists died from starvation and freezing to death because they didn't know how to plant and farm in a like harsh climate like the one on the east coast of Virginia, right? And so the thing about it is, there is evidence also that the harsh climate was so bad and the starving was so bad that they were eating shoe leather, tree bark, and each other. All right, so like this right here is the forensic evidence of actually eating another person. This is the skull of a 14-year-old girl named Jamestown Jane, right? And there are tool marks on her face that show that they were peeling the skin off so they could eat it. All right, which is so gross. But they're gonna end up being saved by the natives that live in that area. Oh, look, go figure. Europeans being saved by Native Americans, and then you're still gonna be jerks about it. So. And those are the Powhatan natives, right? The Powhatan natives are going to show them, like, I don't know if you've ever heard the story of, like, Pocahontas and stuff like that, but they discover from those natives as well this product known as tobacco, right? And they start going back to England and selling tobacco and making tons and tons and tons of money off of it. Plymouth is another big one as well that we'll bring up a little bit later on. It was actually founded by Puritan separatists. I think y'all are talking about this with Mr. Roddy right now because he's the man, right? So, like, and I'm sure we can bring that up a little bit in class as well, right? You're going to see Maryland, Pennsylvania pop up as well. And then you're also going to need to know one thing is going to happen a little bit later on. There's going to be a massive war between England and France much later into the future, all right? We are just bringing up the name right now, right? The French and Indian War is going to come up later, but it's mainly because these different areas are starting to hug up next to each other, right? And so what we're going to do in class tomorrow is I'll put like a map up there and stuff like that so you can see and we can guess who went where and who did what, right? So the French and Indian War is going to pop up in the 1700s. You don't need to know it for this test, but I'm just giving you an understanding that something bad is going to happen a little bit later on, right? So now the other big thing that we got to understand as well is the Columbian Exchange. And honestly, the Columbian Exchange may be probably the single most important thing that we talked about so far, all right? It also is very, like, important because it's, like, unintentional, right? It kind of just happened, okay? So, like, nobody sat around one day and was like, the Columbian Exchange. Well, it's called the Columbian Exchange, and what it is, let's go ahead and give you a definition, a placated definition so you can know what it means. The Columbian Exchange is the informal exchange of goods from the eastern to western hemisphere and vice versa, right? So what I'm getting at is there are things that existed in Europe, Asia, and Africa on the right side of the planet, well, not right, but on the actual, like, eastern hemisphere side of the planet that North American and South Americans, like the Aztecs and the Incas, had never seen before, right? And then same thing for the North and South Americas. There were things the Aztecs, the Incas, and the other natives that lived in North and South America had that the Europeans had never seen before, right? And when Columbus actually lands in the Caribbean, an exchange of items begins, right? We start seeing different items move across the planet. And it's always really, really good to draw this thing, right? I know Scudery's probably thinking about drawing it in her notes right now, but like, look, kid, you don't have to. It's not that big of a deal. But look, let's go ahead and divide this map in half real quick, right? So we've got what's known as like the old world over here and then like the new world over here, which is very dumb because it wasn't the new world. It was also just as old as this old world, but we're not getting into that right now. So there are certain items, let's use vegetables and plants and things like that exist on this side of the planet that never grew on this side of the planet that these people didn't know about, right? We're going to use some big ones, right? The big trinity of vegetables are corn, potatoes, and tomatoes, right? So like corn, potatoes, and tomatoes are 3 examples of vegetables or crops that grew on this side of the planet that these Europeans had never seen before. That's right. Europeans didn't know what corn was. They didn't know what potatoes were, right? Potatoes are very important as well, and we'll bring those up a little bit later on, but the Incans were the ones that started farming potatoes first, right? And so, like, literally, when the Spanish rolled up and they were like, what is this thing that you grow from the ground? This starchy little thing that tastes delicious, especially fried. Like, literally, the Incans like, oh, it's a potato. We got, like, 129 different kinds of them. They're pretty dope. Like, so, like, now, also, the tomatoes is a big one as well, even though early colonists thought they were poisonous, are going to later on be transferred over here. So that's right. Think about this for a brief second. Italians only recently, within the last 600 years, started making tomato sauce, right? Like so, but what's going to happen is when Europeans land in this region, there's going to be an exchange of goods, and these goods are going to be brought back to this side of the planet, and they're going to start being sold, used, cooked, and grown on this side of the planet. And there's things on the other side that ended up coming over here. For example, we use the big 3 products, right? We've got animals from this side, like cows, chickens, pigs, and things like that. We've also got grains, like wheats and cereals and oats and things like that. And then we also have other items like disease, right? Like so that's going to end up being exchanged to this different area as well, right? This Columbian Exchange is going to dramatically affect these 2 sides in very different ways, right? It's going to make a lot of money for the eastern side, and it's also going to kill a very large volume of the people on the western side, right? But the western side will gain grains, animals actually for domestication and things like that, but that's what the Columbian Exchange is. And it's also going to have a dramatic effect on the economy. Now, I know a lot of y'all hate talking about economics, but they're still really important. It's just the science of making money, right? Why would the Columbian Exchange invigorate the economics of all these different areas, right? Well, you got to understand it's going to lead to this thing known as the commercial revolution, right? And the commercial revolution is defined by the dramatic increase in trade and trade goods due to the Columbian Exchange. We now got potatoes for sale. We now got tomatoes for sale. We now got all these different items for sale, right? We got all these different things moving through the different areas of the world, and it's going to create a massive economic boom in the growth of Europe, and it's going to catapult like what was going on during the Renaissance, as well as the growth of those monarchies dramatically forward and make so much money for all these people, right? That's the commercial revolution. You got to understand those goods that they had never seen before are going to be worth lots of money, right? You got to understand the spices coming from India are going to be worth lots of money, right? Like so, and it's going to dramatically invigorate the upper classes and especially the monarchies, because the monarchies are the ones that invested in these adventures, right? They invested in these ventures that went out there and tried to find these different items. And so what's going to happen is, because of these new products, trade is going to increase, right? And you're going to see dramatic effects because of the increased trade. You're going to see more workers that are going to be needed, making more money for regular people. Aha, we're shaking things up, putting money into the pockets of regular people, maybe growing a small middle class, right? We're going to have more cash available for banking and lending because there's more trade going on. If you have more cash for banking and lending, you have more people getting loans, you got more starts of guilds, and you have like businesses popping up, and you also have companies that are going to be on the rise. Keep that in mind. You're going to have companies that are going to be on the rise. Say it with me again. Companies are going to be on the rise. Also, merchant wealth and power is expanding, right? You're going to see the growth of different types of new people where maybe they were merchant guild members and were not nobility. That they're like kind of creating this like decent-sized middle class, right? The middle class is beginning to grow because of that commercial revolution. Well, with more workers are needed for all this increased trade, feudalism's losing its efficiency, right? Like it doesn't really make any sense anymore. So former serfs are moving to towns where they're getting paid for their labor. So you're seeing more money jumping into the economy of Europe. More cash available for banking means more money is going to be available for building a business, which is the seeds of the middle class, right? And speaking of that middle class, that merchant wealth and power expanding, taxes on merchants are going to increase, and this is going to increase the power of monarchies, because who collects those taxes? The kings and queens, not the nobles. Well, the nobles collect them, but a lot of this ends up going to the monarchies as well. And it's going to make it so it's going to decrease the power of the nobility, right? And so as you can see, we're seeing a lot of different foodstuffs and a lot of different things expanding. And the other big effects is like a lot of you are like, oh my God, that's so much to write. You'll be fine, okay? Like this revolution coupled with the Columbian Exchange begins to create a consumer-based economy rather than a subsistence-style economy, right? Consumer means we now have people with money in their pockets that are walking around and trying to buy things, right? It's pushing us towards that. Hasn't really happened yet. It doesn't take full effect until like the 1700s. But a subsistence-based economy is the style of economy that I had in the Middle Ages. Farm enough to stay alive, right? And so this, like, whole thing, nobles need serfs for labor, serfs need nobles for safety, that was a subsistence economy. Not no more. Now these former serfs who are moving to cities and finding work are making money and can go out and buy something, right? So, like, African slave trade, though, is also going to boom after the mass death of the natives through the Inca system. Disease is another important effect. Craft guilds of Europe are going to begin to lose their power and grip to those merchant guilds that are growing dramatically as well. So the big thing about it, though, in general, is that right there is where we're going to cut this flip. We're going to talk about the rise of the companies tomorrow in class, and then go ahead and start talking about the Reformation. I'll see y'all then. Y'all have a good one.